Okay, the face frame is pretty much sanded up and sitting over there setting up while the glue dries. I'm going to go ahead and start cutting the side and bottom panels for the cabinet that we're about to do here for this face frame. And if you've watched our kitchen videos, you've seen me use this jig before. Again, at the place where I purchased the plywood that I use, this pre-finished maple plywood, I had them cut it down to the 15¼ inch dimension that I needed on the width, because remember that the cabinet is going to be 16 inches deep, so the side panels have to be 15¼ and that 3/4 inch thick face frame makes up the difference between there and 16. And so then what I want to do is I want to cut these things. There's going to be a 3/4 inch plywood countertop on this cabinet. So in order to get the height to 32 inches, I want to cut these 31¼ inches long. And so if you've ever seen this jig before, this is simply a panel cutting jig that I use here when I don't have things cut down to size or that they're too big to manage on the table. I don't have a side feed table on the table where I'm comfortable, juggling these larger pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and use this template jig here. And all it is 2 pieces of MDF, one smaller than the other. It's a very easy thing to make this jig and very easy to use it, and you get very precise cuts with little to no tear out on the good piece that you're trying to cut for yourself for your cabinets. And the way you make one of these is, this is just a 1/2 inch sheet of MDF. I don't know, it's about 1 foot long, or you start out with 1 foot long and then you just kind of put this top piece, again, it's about 4 inches long. You probably put it 2 to 3 inches away from one edge. It does not have to be entirely square or perfectly true, because the first cut that you make with your circular saw is going to actually be to cut this excess off. So the fence riding up against this top piece will automatically make it square when it makes the first cut. Then you can go ahead and use the template on all your other cuts. So the way we do this then is, the way you use this particular template is, I always measure up, I'm using kind of a Sharpie type marker here because this stuff is very slick, this pre-finished maple plywood that I almost always use for the inside of the cabinets, and so you need something like this to mark on it. Okay, so I'm going to measure up 31¼ inches, and then I'm going to mark the 16th inch beyond the 31¼ So I want to leave 31¼ So I'm going to mark it between 31¼ and 31 5/16, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, between 31¼ and 31 5/16. Okay, now when I go ahead and snug the piece up, I'm going to make sure the side that I know the saw sled rides against is going to be here. And I'm just going to turn this around and mark it. I'm going to just bring this edge up to where it touches my line. Remember, I made my line 1/16 of an inch past where I needed to go, so that this edge of the jig is actually covering up to the 34¼ inches that I need. I know it's a little bit confusing, but if you go back and watch some of the kitchen videos we did, you'll definitely see it. All I'm doing now, I'm going to cut 2 pieces at the same time, and so I'm just going to make sure that everything is flush on the sides and on the edges here, and then I'm going to pull these out a little bit, and I'm going to take the 2 clamps that I typically use to hold this thing steady, make sure that it's on my mark, clamp them down so that nothing moves while I'm cutting. And then I'm going to go ahead and take the circular saw and run it through. As soon as I find my safety goggles and my glasses, and for your lungs, Okay, now that I have my ear protection and my eye protection, I'm going to go ahead and cut this down to size, and I'll get 2 panels. The other thing you want to take note of is make sure that I have these pieces of wood that I'm going to cut laying on top of some scrap pieces, and I know that the 1/2 inch of the MDF plus the 1.5 inches of this is just short of the capability of the saw, so my blade is going to cut into these scrap pieces. It won't go through to the table beneath them. Very important not to cut through the table you're using. Okay, you can see that the pieces where the edge is nice, and it does not have a lot of chip out because of this jig. The bottom of this jig rides right on the plywood, and so it prevents chip out from the blade coming through the other side. So I've got 2 pieces cut at 15 1/4 now by 31 1/4, and I'm just going to repeat this process and cut 2 more because this cabinet will consist of 4 vertical panels, and you'll see how that goes together if you don't remember from the design video that I showed. So I'm going to set these aside, repeat the process for the top, for the other 2 panels and the bottom panel, bottom shelf pieces, and then we'll be ready pretty much for some assembly. Okay, I've got my pocket hole jig set up here, and I've got the step bit, chucked into the drill, and I'm ready to start drilling some pocket holes, obviously. And if you remember back to the design, this particular cabinet that I'm building is actually 2 small cabinets that'll be kind of bolted together, if you will. And that was the same setup that we did when we created the kitchen cabinet series, when we did the cabinets that were over the stove that had a microwave in the pocket. And we had basically 3 cabinets that we bolted together and 1 solid face frame. And as you can see, the face frame is behind me here. So we're going to do the same. Now, we're not going to put any backs on these cabinets because they're going to be against a wall and they're going to be underneath, and they're going to be predominantly used for storage. And so that's a decision that the client and I came to as we were moving forward in the design, and it makes kind of sense because you don't really need the back on there per se, but you do need some stretchers with which to screw in through to get into the wall and hold everything in place. So what I've got here, I've got all the sides and the bottom, and then I've got all the stretchers that are going to go across the back so that I can screw into the wall, and across the tops so that I can attach the face frame to it. And it's also, the stretchers are going to allow me to drill up through those stretchers to anchor the countertop and the upper cabinet into the base cabinet. So you kind of have to think a little bit ahead here when you're doing these built-ins. So I'm going to go ahead, and I only need to drill 3 of the 4 panels. I'm going to put pocket holes on the side panel facing forward so that I can attach the face frame. The other face frame, the other middle panel, one of the middle panels, we don't really worry about too much. I might put 1 at the top and 1 at the bottom on the very inside just to kind of hold things in, but you don't really need to worry about it because the strength is already taken care of by bolting it to the other cabinet, or the other panel. That's what you get for having, that's the benefit of having 1 face frame, is that it already anchors the middle of the cabinet, so you don't have to worry about the doors, jiggling or anything like that when they're attached to the face frame. And then on 1 of the stretchers that's toward the front, I'm going to be putting some holes toward the front to be able to, again, lock down the face frame. And the other ones, I'll just put them on the sides in order to be able to, go into the sides of the cabinet. So I got my trusty drill out here, and the 2 panels, I always pick the worst side, and I do this one. This one has a blemish in it. This side doesn't. So I typically drill them on the side that have the blemishes in there. So I'll do that now. I think my dog approves. So, okay, we'll get started now. We'll get that done, and then we'll start putting everything together. And this cabinet, despite how much I talk on the videos, pretty much, this is a very quick cabinet to make, all in all. Especially if you've already watched our kitchen cabinet series, this is going to be like nothing for you. And you just put these pocket holes, you know, every 6 inches, some people consider overkill, but that's about what I do. I just kind of eyeball it, and I do every 6 inches. If you're not comfortable eyeballing it, then, you know, go ahead and mark every 6 inches real quick, you know, somewhere up here to be able to keep track of it. Okay, I've got all the pocket holes drilled in each of the pieces that I need. All the stretchers, all the side panels, and all the bottom panels. And so now what I'm going to do is just make sure, remember this is building 2 smaller carcasses, and then we're going to bind those carcasses together. And what I've done in order to attach the bottom, you've seen me do this before in other videos, but in order to attach the bottom, I've simply cut a spacer block that I can align flush with the bottom of this, and once I set the shelf, making sure that the pocket holes are aligned forward so that I can screw in the you know, the face frame. Once all I'm looking to do is I measured it, right? So if this bottom rail is 3.5 inches, then if I take a 3/4 inch away from that, I'm going to get it 2 3/4. And so I cut my spacer block just a hair under 2 3/4 because I'm okay if this sits a little proud of the surface. So in other words, if this isn't exactly flush but this is higher, I'm okay with that. We can always sand that if we need to, really, but you don't have to. But if it sits below it, it's going to look kind of ugly, so I don't want any of this showing. So I cut it just a hair under 2 3/4, and you can kind of see, I guess, here that if I sort of just align it a little bit like that, and I put this block here as a spacer, you can kind of see that it's pretty much flush with the frame, and I'm perfectly good with that. I think that's perfectly fine. Okay, now that the 2 sides are attached to the bottom, and I've got the right spacing for the bottom rail to be pretty flush with the bottom shelf, which is what I want, now it's time to just basically put in the stretchers. And this is actually a fairly simple exercise. What I'm going to end up doing is I put in 3 stretchers. Now, I said before there's going to be no back on this. So I'm going to put in 3 stretchers. This is the front stretcher, and it's going to have 3 pocket holes, screws into the side, 3 into the other side, and 1, 2, 3, 4 facing forward, so that I can, it might stay, yeah, it might not, so that I can basically, you know, lock in the face frame when I go to put that on. And so then the back one, which just has 3 left and 3 right, there's nothing else. That's going to go back here toward the back, and then I want a nailing cleat back there, so I'm basically going to put this one such that these 3 screws will go up into this stretcher, and I'm going to nail or screw them in with, like so, you know, with the screws to the back. So this will be the thing that I'm going to drive my screws through into the studs when we go to mount the cabinet. So it's 1 stretcher in the front, 1 on the other back at the top, and then 1 kind of vertical here, you know, for the nailing fin or this, you know, to screw it into the wall. And then we're just going to, you know, repeat this exact same process for the second cabinet. The only difference with the second cabinet is on both of these panels, I have pocket holes all along the side, and that's going to anchor into the face frame. But remember, I'm going to anchor these 2 boxes together, so once I attach half of the face frame, I'm no longer going to be able to get at the panel on the other side. So what I've done is, instead of putting pocket holes all along this edge to go to the front, I've only put 3 pocket holes, 1 towards the top and then 2 towards the bottom, which will be completely hidden by the panel. This one at the top will be partially concealed by the top rail, but then doors will close over these cabinets. So if you happen to open the cabinet and stick your hand in underneath, you might see this pocket hole. I can certainly come back and plug that with pocket hole plugs if I really need to. But in this way, you're absolutely assured that you're going to get, you know, a very strong bond with the face frame and all the members in a single cabinet. And it's going to be, you know, again, very strong. This is a very strong joinery technique. It's going to last a long time. It can put up with a lot of weight. But the reason I'm building the cabinet this way is because I want extra support here in the middle, because this is going to be a longer span, and there's going to be bookcases on top of this, and they may pack a lot of books on it. I don't know. So I want to take into account the fact that there might be considerable amount of weight on there. So I'm going to go ahead and attach build the other cabinet, and then attach all the other stretchers, and then I'll come back and you'll see me put the face frame on this cabinet, and I'll have one thing to explain about the end panel that's going to be visible in the living room space, and then we'll be done with the lower cabinet. Okay, we've got both cabinet carcasses complete, and the face frame is here behind me. But before we assemble everything together, it's easier now, since the cabinets are a little bit lighter and a little bit smaller, to drill some of the shelf pinholes. And if you watched our kitchen video series, you've seen this jig before and this bit before. And just as a quick refresher, this little drill bit has a spring and a collar on it, so it only goes so deep. And it's a perfect 1/4 inch drill bit that it's going to use this jig template here. It's got a little collar on it, or a little shoulder, that allows it to fit just inside. And then, as you can see, it's going to push through and drill these holes. Now, when you're doing a base cabinet for a built-in, the base cabinets are typically smaller, somewhere between 28 and 32 inches, not quite as tall as a kitchen cabinet, which are about at 36. So you don't need really a lot of shelf pinholes for the lower base cabinets. You just need 6 or 7, you know, around the middle of the cabinet, so that there's some adjustability with the shelf underneath, in case they've got the homeowner has some, you know, larger items or smaller items and they want to rearrange the shelf. So we're going to drill our shelf pinholes now using the bit that you've seen before. You've seen us use before. And in order to do this, what I typically do is get my tape measure, which is over here. And what I want to do is kind of just roughly measure what the middle of the, you know, the middle of the distance between the bottom shelf and just this top stretcher here. And right now, it looks like that distance is 27 inches, so half of that would be 13.5. And I already made a mark at the 13.5 mark here. So if I do that, I kind of want to understand where the middle of this jig is. And this is a handy little jig. I use this thing a lot, actually, even though I have other jigs in the shop to drill shelf pinholes. This is really handy for built-ins because it's just enough to do a few holes either way. You don't need a lot. I'm going to show you another method of drilling shelf pin holes when we build the upper bookcase cabinets, which are also going to have shelf pin holes in them, but there's going to be a lot more. And although in the kitchen series it was definitely designed for people who didn't want to spend a lot of money on tools, you know, it does get to be kind of a pain in the rear end to, you know, put this thing down, drill all your holes, move it down, drill out more holes, move it down, drill more holes, etc. That's a lot of holes to be drilling by hand. So we're going to show you a quick way to improve the speed and efficiency of drilling your shelf pin holes. So anyway, what I do then is, you can tell there's no index line, but basically these holes are absolutely symmetrical from one end to the other, and that's actually very important so that it doesn't matter which end you apply against your shelf or against a stopping block. It's always going to be the same distance no matter which way you have the jig turned, and that's very important. So what I'm going to do is, there's some letters that you probably can't see. It says row A and row B for the 2 different rows of holes that I have here. I'm just going to eyeball that and line it up right in the middle of where that the hole where the row A and row B labeling is. So somewhere in the middle hole, just make sure it lines up pretty well. And it doesn't matter, again, that it's exact as long as they're all the same. So you don't want your shelf pin holes a little bit off from one another, otherwise you'll get a wobbly shelf. And you don't really want that, obviously. So anyway, once I put it in the middle, I just measure from the base of the cabinet up to the jig, and it's about 4 inches. So again, it's not important to get it to the 32nd or what the actual measurement is from the bottom of the shelf. It just matters that they're all the same. And in order to make things all the same, a lot of times I use spacer blocks, and I really, really like using them. So I already ripped a piece of this 4 inches wide. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just set this spacer block down here against the bottom shelf, and then I'm going to butt up the jig against that. Again, it looks right, almost right in the middle here. And then that's how I'm going to drill all of the holes the same way. They'll all be aligned at the same heights, so I'm not going to get any wobbly shelves. So I'm going to have to turn kind of this away from the camera to anchor it to the edge of the table here. But basically the premise is the same as we've done in previous videos, so I don't want to spend too much on it. I just thought it was kind of important, again, to point out whenever you can use a spacer block or some kind of block or jig for easy repetitive movements, that you're going to ensure accuracy and you'll have a much more successful project. So in any case, all I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp this board to the piece of wood here, and then I'm going to butt up this jig and clamp the jig, and then I'm going to chuck the special drill bit into the drill, and then we'll be ready to go. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm going to drill that hole, and I'm going to go 3 to the right and 3 to the left, and that'll give you about 7 holes, just enough to move the shelf up and down a little bit, again, to support larger items if that's what you need. So I've got to drill this side, the back side, and then underneath here and here, so I'll be flipping the table and moving it around a lot. The carcass for the cabinet, I'll be moving that around a lot. So I'm not going to show you all of that because it's kind of boring, but at least we'll get started here. And then once I get all of the shelf pin holes drilled in both carcasses, then I'll be able to put everything together and this cabinet will be done. Alright, I've got all the shelf pin holes drilled for both of these two carcasses, and now it's time to actually put the carcasses together and attach the face frame like so. Well, the first of the base cabinets is actually now complete. I'm going to sand this up a little bit and clean it up with 150 or 220 grit sandpaper, and then it'll be ready for priming. I tend to use a shellac primer. You can also use an oil primer if you want. And then you can brush that on, because the way the primer dries, when you sand before you actually apply your finish coat, it'll be really smooth. You won't see any brush marks or bumps. So I tend to apply it with a brush or a sponge brush, and then we're going to finish it up with a couple of coats of white latex paint. And the other cabinet that we built, the other base cabinet, is actually much simpler than this. So I'm not going to show that in the interest of time. I won't show the actual creation of that, but that base cabinet, if you watch the first video on the design that we took you through, the other base cabinet on the other side of the fireplace is actually much simpler. It's only 40 inches wide, I think, about 40 inches wide, and it's basically like building one carcass just like we've built here, and we put the face frame on exactly the same way. Now, the last thing that I want to do is measure doors, and I'm going to repeat this process again here, even though we did this in the kitchen video series that we did, because it can get a little bit complicated. I have had a lot of people ask, when you're putting two doors in the same cavity where there's no center stile for each door to rest against in the middle, what do you do about the gap in between? Should there be a gap? And the answer is absolutely there should be a gap. And the reason there's a gap is because there's seasonal changes in humidity. In the summertime, the humidity goes up, particularly in Chicago where I live, or even in the South, and that humidity goes up and the wood swells. And so if your gap is too narrow, those doors will close. They'll either pinch shut and it'll be tough to get them open, or they're going to overlay one another. They're not going to close right against the face frame. One will close on top of each another because of the expansion. So you do have to have a gap in the middle. Now, the hinges that I use on the doors, when I use concealed hinges, allow you to manipulate the door in 3 dimensions. So that's really great, because if you have the door like so, you can close the dimension, the gap, up a little bit by altering that the XY dimension here in this plane, and so therefore you can narrow that gap if you need to, or widen it out to fix that if that happens to you. So we definitely want a gap. Now the rule of thumb that I use, I want an 1/8 of an inch gap in the middle. Is that too wide? Maybe. Could I make it a 1/16? Maybe. Particularly with these doors, because they are flat panel doors, and they're going to be flat panel doors, and they're going to be created with an MDF panel in the center, so they're not going to expand as much as they might. But they still will expand a little bit, so I might be able to tighten that up, and I can take care of that with the hinges. So let's do the height measurement of our doors first. We're going to order these doors like I typically nowadays. I've made a lot of doors, and sometimes they're just easier to order. And I like the company that I go with. It's on my website, plus you guys have been asking, and I usually post. Anyway, the height is 25 1/4, and I want the doors to overlay a 1/2 inch more up here and a 1/2 inch more down there. So for the height of the doors, I just add 1 total inch. So if it's 25 1/4 inches for the opening, I just make it 26 1/4. And all 4 of these doors are going to be 26 1/4 inches high. Now, the slightly more complicated part comes, and I'm going to give you a formula basically, is each door is going to be, if you take the size of the opening, imagine that it's just one big door. The size of the opening is 22 1/2. So then I want a 1/2 inch over to the left and a 1/2 inch over to the right for my overlay, but I want this gap in the middle. But pretend that gap's not there for just a second. So normally my doors would be 22 1/2, and if this was one big door, it would be 23 1/2. So if I take 23 1/2 and I divide by 2, then I'm going to get 11 3/4. That's the measurement. I wrote it down just so I wouldn't speak it incorrectly. So that would be 11 3/4. So normally each door would be 11 3/4. However, we want to take an 1/8 of an inch out of the overall measurement, so we're going to split that in half, and 1/2 of an 1/8 is a 1/16. And I'm going to take a 1/16 of an inch off of each door so that I get that 1/8 of an inch gap. And again, if I want to close it up, it's only a 1/16 or so, so I'm going to be able to do that with the hinges. So that I take that 11 3/4 and I minus 1/16, and that's going to give me a door measurement width of 11 11/16. And a good door manufacturer will get to the 16th inch level. These guys that I go with, the Waltzcraft folks, they're really good, and they can get you a door that's going to be exactly 11 and 11/16. So again, the formula for the width of a double door with a gap in the middle is basically the measurement of the width of the entire cavity plus 1 divided by 2 minus a 1/16, and that's each door. So it's a little bit of thinking it out a little bit first, but it shouldn't be very hard. If you had a hard time understanding that, just rewind the tape and play it again. So actually, it's not a tape; it's a YouTube video. So there you go. Anyway, so that finishes up this carcass. I'm going to get the other one finished, and then next video we're going to start on the upper bookcases that we have, and that's going to be very interesting because there's going to be a couple of arches in these bookcase cavities, and I'm going to show you 2 different ways to make arches on your bookcases if that's what you want. You know, they're both very pretty simple ways, but you should know both ways, so we'll probably put those in the skill builder, or we might do one in the video and do another one in the skill builder section of our video. So anyway, I appreciate you watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.